Yes, Mr.
Lady. Today's first witness is Michael Gove, please.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Mr. Gove, may I make the same apology to you that I've made to other witnesses? But the fact the modular structure means we have to call you back again. I'm sorry about the demands we're making on your time.
I quite understand, my lady.
Could you commence your evidence, please, by giving us your full name?
Michael Andrew Gove.
Mr. Gove, thank you for your provision of a further witness statement in these proceedings. Your statement of the 1st of September 2023 for the purposes of this module. I want to start, please, your evidence by asking you some questions about your past ministerial role. You were Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster between the 24th of July 2019 and the 15th of September 2021, is that correct?
Yes.
But you also held the post of Minister for the Cabinet Office between the 13th of February 2020 and the 15th of September 2021. Why did you fill both posts? Why were you fulfilling both those positions?
When I was first appointed as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, the Prime Minister made it clear that my role at that time was to lead on preparations for Brexit, and in particular for preparations for a potential no-deal scenario. It had been the case, I believed, and the Prime Minister certainly believed, that preparations for Brexit had not been made in the way that they should have been, and that was my sole focus during the time that I was Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, CDL, alone. After the general election, the Prime Minister believed that government should be reconfigured, and he wanted to give me a slightly broader role, now, of course, that he enjoyed a majority and that a Brexit deal had been secured in outline, and that broader role was to encompass looking at how the Cabinet Office might improve coordination of government policy, particularly, but not exclusively, with the devolved administrations.
Was your appointment as Minister for the Cabinet Office connected in any way with the dawning realisation of the crisis, the coronavirus crisis, which of course was beginning to make itself apparent?
I don't believe so.
You therefore held two ministerial posts broadly connected with the workings of the Cabinet Office. And did that mean that you were broadly responsible and you held the ministerial responsibility for dealing with matters such as civil contingencies, the resilience of government, with the response to civil emergencies? Was that all broadly within your brief?
Yes, but I had observed before taking on this role and realised very quickly upon taking on this role that the way in which the Cabinet Office was configured was not, to my mind, appropriate for the type of pandemic that we faced and indeed the type of crisis that requires an effective whole-of-government response.
I'm going to ask you some questions about the Cabinet Office in a moment. Before I do so, and just to conclude the issue of your ministerial positions, then on the 15th of September 2021, were you appointed Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, and also Minister for Intergovernmental Relations. Why were you appointed to both those positions?
The Prime Minister recognised that levelling up was a principal focus of domestic policy that had not, in his view, at that time, had the focus and drive devoted to it required. So he strengthened the department, which I took over previously, MHCLG, the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government. We had an additional permanent secretary who was appointed on a temporary basis. I know it may seem odd to have a temporary permanent secretary, but Andy Haldane joined us in order to drive that activity. But intergovernmental relations, which had been exercised from the Cabinet Office, was added, and I think the Prime Minister believed that it was a complement to the work of levelling up across the whole United Kingdom to have a minister responsible for coordination with the devolved administrations.
And what was the genesis of that ministerial position, Minister for Intergovernmental Relations. Had there been a review, in fact, before that time, into United Kingdom government union capability?
Absolutely. Conducted by Lord Dunlop, Andrew Dunlop, originally commissioned when Theresa May was Prime Minister, and of course the experience during COVID reinforced the need for us to have a more coherent approach towards sharing information and coordinating policy across the whole United Kingdom.
In broad terms, did your appointment as Secretary of State for Levelling Up and as Minister for Intergovernmental Relations mean that you were less involved in decision-making relating to COVID from that date of appointment, 15th September 2021?
Yes.
All right. Coming back to the Cabinet Office, the inquiry has heard evidence, and particularly in the context of Module 1, to the effect that the Cabinet Office performs a vital role at the heart of government in liaising between other government departments, synthesising the response of government, in broking, if you like, the affairs of government between its various multifaceted parts. There has been an abundance of evidence in this module, Mr. Gove, to the effect that over and above perhaps a degree of expected chaos or confusion in the face of an unprecedented crisis, the Cabinet Office was largely dysfunctional. And that is a word that's been used by Mr. Cummings, by Mark Sedwell, the former Cabinet Secretary, the former Deputy Cabinet Secretary, Helen McNamara, and others. How, as you see it, and you'd been a Minister of the Cabinet Office for some time, how was that position allowed to develop?
For a variety of reasons. I think the first thing is that the inherent structure of the Cabinet Office was flawed. Normally, the lead minister, the Secretary of State, is responsible for everything that happens in his department, and of course, or her department, and answerable to the House of Commons, accountable for what happens there. But the Cabinet Office is different. There is much within the Cabinet Office that is not within the purview and not within the control of whoever happens to be the lead Cabinet Office Minister, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Minister for the Cabinet Office, or whatever. So there are significant parts of the Cabinet Office that answer to the Cabinet Secretary or to the Prime Minister rather than to the lead Minister for the Cabinet Office. And as Helen McNamara, I think, points out in her evidence, in paragraph 22 of her evidence, she says that in July 2019, she had been given clear instructions by the Prime Minister's team that following the de facto Deputy Prime Minister model, which some attribute the role of CDL into being, was not the intention behind appointing Mr. Govan to the Cabinet Office. My teams and I should be clear that our ministerial accountability, flowed through the Prime Minister only. And I think actually, even though Helen was talking about the particular circumstances under which I was appointed, it was a feature of the way in which the Cabinet Office worked, that various secretariats there, the National Security Secretariat and so on, worked to the Prime Minister.
Ministerially, to whom should the inquiry look in terms of accountability for the state into which the Cabinet Office descended prior to the onset of the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I would take two steps back. I think my point would be that the Cabinet Office, in and of itself, over many years, has operated in a way which is not as effective as it should be for the effective delivery of government policy, both business as usual and also in response to crises. In the first module, we touched on the lead department model for responding to crises. And there is much merit in that for many of the crises that government faces. An animal health emergency or a flooding emergency are best handled using the expertise that DEFRA, for example, has. But when we're dealing with a whole system crisis of the kind that COVID clearly was, then the lead departmental model is not adequate for that. We had an approach, the Cabinet Office had an approach, which I fear ceded too much responsibility to lead government departments and did not mean the assumption of sufficient responsibility at the centre. And we can see that in the way in which the Civil Contingencies Secretariat believed that it was supposed to respond. It was not occupying, I believe, their space, and it did not exercise the authority that it should have done across government, partly because of the lead department model. And that is a structural issue of government that had not been addressed, and which I believe this inquiry is seeking to address.
Can I return to the structural position in a moment? My question was in fact directed at the nature of the Cabinet Office itself, rather than structural issues which may have arisen between itself and other government departments, in particular the response of government in the face of a whole government crisis. The Cabinet Office itself has been described as dysfunctional, bloated, too many senior levels, too many director generals, a degree of duplication and confusion, a huge number of communications engagement staff, and so on. That is a facet of the Cabinet Office itself, not any other lead government department. Why do you think that the Cabinet Office came to be in such a state?
Well, again, the Cabinet Office acquired additional responsibilities before and during my time there. There was a tendency, there has been a tendency, amongst successive prime ministers to shove into the Cabinet Office responsibilities that do not appear to fit conveniently or easily elsewhere. At different times, different prime ministers have used the Cabinet Office, for example, to lead on drugs policy or on policy towards charities and the third sector. So it becomes a sort of Mary Poppins bag into which different prime ministers will shove things that they believe require to be dealt with by the government's nanny, as it were. And it's also the case that the Cabinet Office, under previous ministers, had acquired responsibility, which I believe is right, for ensuring that various cross-government functions, procurement, communications and buildings and so on, were administered more effectively. And on many of those occasions, as the Cabinet Office grew, as its responsibilities grew, what we did not have was the drains-up exercise to look and to focus on what exactly should be done through the Cabinet Office and what should be done through other government departments and what should be done in Number 10. And when I assumed responsibility for the whole of the Cabinet Office in the middle of February and in early March, I believed that we needed to change the way in which it operated. And I made my views clear to the Prime Minister, to the Cabinet Secretary, and to those working for the Prime Minister that we needed to reform the way in which the Cabinet Office operated.
Again, Mr. Gove, you've referred to the areas for which the Cabinet Office became responsible and to the structural system around it. Was it not apparent to you, particularly when you became Minister for the Cabinet Office, that in terms of personnel, in terms of its working arrangements, in terms of its ability to function, there were very serious concerns revolving around the nature of the Cabinet Office?
On the question of personnel, I would gently push back. I think that the Cabinet Office had some of the finest civil servants in Whitehall working within it. And overall, I was and continue to be impressed by many of those who work there. And it was certainly the case that one of the additional responsibilities that the Cabinet Office had, as we mentioned earlier, from July, was preparing for the UK's departure from the European Union. During that time, some of the civil servants, both who were there and who joined, were among some of the finest public servants that this country has. I would not blame them. I think the dysfunction in the Cabinet Office was a consequence of two things. Responsibilities being added in a piecemeal and cumulative way without strategic thought being given to how the Cabinet Office would discharge all of those. and a related failure to think strategically about how the centre of government should be reconfigured.
Regardless of whether the cause was a systemic one, a structural one, a problem with the Cabinet Office, in blunt terms, being given too much to do, the reality in terms of the impact was very serious, was it not?
Oh, yes.
The government body responsible for synthesising the response of government in the face of this unprecedented crisis was largely, as it must have seemed to you, not fit for purpose in February, March, April, May of 2020.
Yes, and I want to take this opportunity, if I may, my lady, to apologise to the victims who endured so much pain, the families who endured so much loss as a result of the mistakes that were made by government in response to the pandemic. And as a minister responsible for the Cabinet Office and who was also close to many of the decisions that were made, I must take my share of responsibility for that. Politicians are human beings, we're fallible. We make mistakes and we make errors. And I'm sure that the inquiry will have an opportunity to look in detail at many of the errors I and others made. But I also want to stress that I and those with whom I worked were also seeking at every point, in circumstances where every decision was difficult and every course was bad, to make those decisions that we felt we could in order to try to deal with an unprecedented virus and a remarkable assault on the institutions of the country.
Could we have, please, the report from Helen McNamara on the screen, 136755. Mr. Gove, you'll be very familiar with this document.
Yes.
It's a document about which Helen McNamara herself, somebody who I'm sure you would also describe as being one of our finest public servants.
Absolutely.
Prepared in May 2020. And the tenor of this document, Mr. Gove, is that not in terms of the structural responsibilities of the Cabinet Office, but in terms of its output, in terms of the personnel, in terms of the culture, in terms of what it was actually able to do, there were very serious problems. The culture was not getting the best from people. There was powerlessness. There was bad behaviour from leaders, too much politics, the talking over of junior women. She says, too many Cabinet Office senior leaders, which means they can't take decisions without consulting others. A superhero culture. The Cabinet Office has fallen out of shape. Those are damning observations, are they not?
Yes, they are. And Helen's broader evidence points to the way in which, as she says, the Cabinet Office is not elastic. It was moved into a particular shape as a result of some of the successive responsibilities that I mentioned earlier. And so the overall structure of the Cabinet Office was not such that it could perform as it should, as any government department should, when faced with a crisis. Some of the behaviour that Helen quite rightly points out and calls out is, I think, a regrettable feature of one of our failures to effectively and at an early stage change the way in which the Cabinet Office worked. And as I mentioned earlier, there were a variety of changes that I wished to make, including some that I did make to personnel, which were intended to address some, though not all, of the concerns that Helen rightly raises.
Right at the bottom of that first page, there are these words: sense that Cabinet Office has lost its way in making the Whitehall machine work for number 10, and then over the page, not synthesising departments or leveraging machine. That is a fairly broad observation, of course, but it may be thought to be an obvious one. If it had appeared to Helen McNamara that in this very general sense the Cabinet Office was failing in its primary role of leveraging the government machine, that must have been apparent to you from being Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, which of course is a related Cabinet Office ministerial role, and certainly from February 2020 when you became Minister for the Cabinet Office.
Yes.
What did you do yourself in February, March, April to address the concerns which you appear to have shared?
Well, the first thing is that when I was Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster solely, as I mentioned earlier, my focus was on Brexit preparations. And again, we discussed in the inquiry the extent to which I believe that those helped us to prepare for some of the challenges of COVID. But after assuming responsibility for the whole of the Cabinet Office, I sought to try to wrestle it into shape. And I, both with my private office and also with the new Permanent Secretary, Alex Chisholm, made a series of recommendations as to how things should and might change, improving its analytical function, changing the way in which reporting lines operated. But if I may, one of the things that I found while I was there, and even as the situation with COVID was looming on the horizon, was that I discovered during the course of those early weeks that there were parts of the Cabinet Office and ways in which the Cabinet Office operated that were shielded almost from my scrutiny and intervention. A case in point occurred when on the 3rd of March, I believe, I had to answer an urgent question about the resignation of Philip Rutnam as Permanent Secretary at the Home Office and the consequences for the position of the then Home Secretary, Dame Priti Patel. I was preparing as the Minister accountable to go into the House of Commons to answer the question when, shortly before I went in, I was told, and didn't know beforehand, that there was an inquiry going on as to whether or not the then Home Secretary had breached the ministerial code. That inquiry was supervised by the Propriety and Ethics team within the Cabinet Office, who do a peerless job, but I wasn't aware of that at all. So a key element in the Cabinet Office, a key team, was shielded from my scrutiny and my ability to both know what was going on and then ask questions about its effectiveness. At various different times in the run-up to that UQ and afterwards, I sought, by talking to Number 10 and making clear my frustrations, that we needed to fundamentally alter how the Cabinet Office worked. And indeed, I expressed my views, including to Dominic Cummings, sometimes in very direct terms, about the need for change and reform in the way in which the Cabinet Office operated.
And Mr. Gove, we will look in due course at some of the, well, many of the suggestions that you made in relation to reform of the Cabinet Office structure. But again, why did this revelatory understanding about the state of the Cabinet Office not occur whilst you were Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, that is to say, between July of 2019 and February of 2020? It must have become apparent to you, while you discharged that important ministerial responsibility, that the government department for which you were at least indirectly responsible was failing.
Well, the first thing is that my responsibility as CDL was to make sure that the inadequate preparations that we had made for our departure from the European Union were ramped up. And that was the principal focus of my work. It meant enlisting additional people from outside the Cabinet Office to come in. Already I was aware that in one area, a central area of government responsibility, government was not configured as it should be. I was, during that time, increasingly aware of some of the inherent dysfunction within the Cabinet Office, but it was only when I assumed full responsibility as MCO that it became clear to me quite how dysfunctional the structure of the organisation was. And as I mentioned earlier, there were parts of the Cabinet Office that, and perhaps rightly, considered themselves not to be responsible to or accountable to me, or indeed anyone who was CDL or MCO. And I used to refer to parts of the Cabinet Office as the dark side of the moon, because they were obscured from my gaze.
if you were increasingly aware, as you say you were, why did you take no steps prior to March 2020 to address the problem?
I was appointed to be MCO, I think, on the 13th of February. And I think within weeks, I was making clear to Number 10 and others.
No, I mean, I apologise. Between July 19, when you were Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and March 2020, when you had your feet under the table of that new ministerial responsibility.
Again, it's a feature and in the nature of cabinet government that you can make observations to the Prime Minister and to others about the weaknesses that you discern in other parts of government, but there are delineations of responsibility. So,
Did you, and I apologise for interrupting, did you make those observations between July 19 and February 2020?
I made some observations informally about some features of how the government machine was operating, but at that time, I was prioritising what I considered to be the role and mission that the Prime Minister had given me and which I believed was absolutely critical. So as I arrived as Minister for the Cabinet Office alongside being Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, I had concerns, but I wanted to familiarise myself with the shape and structure in greater detail before then making recommendations for change. Normally, in previous cabinet roles, when I've arrived in departments and I believed that there needed to be change, I've taken a couple of months before instituting what some of those changes are, because I wanted to make sure that I properly understood why things are the way they are, before then arguing for change. When I arrived at the Cabinet Office, it was rather quicker. There is a principle in politics, the principle of Chesterton's fence. Sometimes the existence of a particular institution or protocol seems irrational, but before you remove it, you need to understand why it might have been put there. And that applies in other government departments. Don't immediately rush to change things before understanding why they were there.
Well,
but as you say, while I was Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, I became increasingly aware of the need for change. And then, as Minister for the Cabinet Office, I sought quickly to familiarise myself with those aspects of the operation of the Cabinet Office that I had not been directly responsible for beforehand, and became even more seized of the need for changing how it worked.
You're not suggesting, of course, that dysfunctionality, if revealed in the heart of a government department, is something that should not be addressed?
No. No, it absolutely should be addressed. Right. But my point is one born of experience, which is you need to understand why things are the way they are, that things which at first or even second glance within government or within any institution, which may seem a barrier to progress or may seem illogical, must have seemed at one point logical to someone. So you need to understand why things are the way they are before then saying, right, this needs to change, the justification has fallen away, the logic behind this decision no longer applies.
Was it also apparent to you from February 2020 that there were very serious systemic issues in the heart of Number 10? The inquiries heard a great deal of evidence about the toxicity, the atmosphere in Number 10, the behaviour of people in Number 10. You will be familiar with the references in the Cabinet Secretary's WhatsApps to it being like taming wild animals. Nothing in Mr. Case's past experience had prepared him for the madness. He'd never seen a bunch of people less well equipped to run a country. That could not have been hidden from you as Minister for the Cabinet Office, could it?
I think Mr. Case's evidence...
well, he hasn't given evidence yet.
I think that WhatsApp refers to circumstances later in our response to COVID, but I entirely understand your point. I think it is the case that almost every number 10 operation has had by its nature strong personalities. Sometimes those personalities clash, sometimes under tension. Humans express themselves in ways which, with the benefit of hindsight, they regret. It is certainly the case that under Boris Johnson, there were strong personalities in number 10, but those strong personalities had been responsible for helping to secure not just an election victory, but an end to the logjam in Parliament over Brexit. And many of those strong personalities needed to be assertive in order to deal with some of the other challenges that we faced.
But you accept, do you not, that this was an issue going beyond personality clash? The behaviour, the style, the personalities of the people in number 10 had a direct impact on its functionality, on its ability to perform in the face of this unprecedented crisis. You would accept that proposition?
Well, I think that you're never going to get a perfect team of personalities, all of whom are beautifully aligned and amongst whom there is perfect harmony. You will always have, it's in the nature of politics, strong views, sometimes punctually expressed. The key thing, I think, is overall, does the system accommodate a diversity of opinion? And then, once a resolution is reached, does it implement that policy quickly and effectively? And I think that you know, the nature of politics, the nature of decision-making in any organisation under pressure means that people do sometimes need to be, you know, a little bit direct.
The evidence, Mr. Gove, suggests, well, the point is not that a council of perfection should have been expected on the part of number 10, but that it was dysfunctional, that it was chaotic, that in terms of its ability to produce policy, as you've described it, to implement government decision-making, it was, to use the words of Mr. Cummings himself, dysfunctional.
I think that there were, Mr. Cummings's written evidence goes into great length about many of the frustrations that he felt, even before he entered government, about the way in which it worked. I share many, if not all, of his concerns and views about some of the weaknesses of the way in which government operates. But I think that it's in the nature of anyone who's a reformer that they will feel the need to test the effectiveness of delivery and then want to seek to improve it, sometimes by being exacting and tough, but one would hope always with an understanding of the human factor as well. And I think that the question of how effective government was and is best discerned from a detailed look at its response to different crises. And again, I would not want to preempt the committee's conclusions at all, but I think I would argue that the government of Boris Johnson, when it came to preparation for Brexit, executed that well. When it came to the vaccine rollout, executed that well. But there are other areas which I know the inquiry will look at where it would be quite wrong to award ourselves high marks.
Well, I'm going to press you on that, Mr. Gove. In terms of the government's overall response in those early months to the crisis and deliberately not addressing the issue of vaccines, the government response was deficient. There was a chaotic and dysfunctional element inside number 10, inside the Cabinet Office, and the government, whether you put it in terms of, using your words, in terms of output or delivery, was significantly off the mark, was it not?
I think it was the case that there were specific failings, and we can go on to list them, But I would add two things. The first is that governments across the developed world were dealing with a novel virus, and governments across the Western world scrambled to appreciate quite how devastating the impact of this virus would be on their healthcare systems, on their economies, and on vulnerable people within their societies. So, of course, mistakes and errors were made by the UK government, and some of them were unique and specific to the UK government. But I also think that we need to remember that governments everywhere made errors. This is not to excuse me from my responsibility for the mistakes that I made. It's simply to say that when dealing with a crisis of this kind, one needs to appreciate that for democratic politicians everywhere, there were sudden and accumulating pressures, which some dealt with better than others, but also the very nature of the virus and the nature of the response required became more and more apparent over time as more and more evidence came to light, as we've seen from the evidence presented to the inquiry. Originally, there was scepticism about asymptomatic transmission. As we've seen from the evidence presented to the inquiry, there was a strong body of scientific evidence that suggested that, for example, to lock down earlier than we did would have tested the patience and the endurance of the British public in a way that was not sustainable.
Can I interrupt you there to say, of course, we're going to look at some of the decision-making, and important decision-making, and the information available to the government. But before we move on from this topic, Mr. Gove, you would accept that, however eloquently advanced, that those observations in relation to the performance of other governments can only be proffered by way of mitigation. They are not an answer to the basic charge, I don't mean that in a legal sense, that there were failings in the heart of the government machine, its departments, its centre, its operations in Number 10, that directly impacted upon its ability to respond to the crisis.
Yes, but I think that it's important that we are specific and that we look at specific incidents. So it's understandable that people will express themselves in WhatsApps in the heat of the moment, or even in evidence in placid recollection. They will express themselves with frustration, sometimes anger, about what they see and what went on. That is human. What is also human is making mistakes. The key thing is, were individuals case by case operating in a way that was cavalier, irrational, or foolish? And my contention would be that if we look in detail at each of the processes of decision-making, we can understand that many of the weaknesses were as a result of systemic factors. Other weaknesses were as a result of people's preferences, instincts, and judgments, leading them in a particular direction, which, with the benefit of hindsight, was wrong.
Indeed. The DHSC, you must have been in a position to form a view, in a general sense, about its ability to respond to the crisis. Evidence has been given in this module from Mr. Cummings, from Lord Sedwell, also by Sir Patrick Vallance, with particular reference to his diaries, to the effect that between February and May 2020, the DHSC was overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. I don't wish to engage with you on the merits of the lead government department model. We must focus on the practical response, the practical ability of that department to be able to respond to the crisis. Would you agree with that proposition, that it was indeed overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis?
I think I would put it in a slightly different way. I think that, and I fear I am having to go back to the lead department model, not as a shield behind which DHSC should be protected from criticism, but just broadly to contextualise. The first thing that I would say is that I have a very high opinion of the then and current Permanent Secretary at the Department, Sir Chris Wormold, with whom I worked at the Department for Education. The other thing that I would say is that I also, and I know not everyone testifying towards this inquiry has, I also have a high opinion of Matt Hancock as a minister. However, I believe that too much was asked of DHSC at that point, and it goes to the heart of one of the challenges that I mentioned earlier. We should collectively have recognised that this was a whole system crisis at an earlier point and taken on to other parts of government the responsibility for delivery that was being asked of DHSC at that time. I think with the benefit of hindsight, those within DHSC felt we can do it. We can meet this hour. And I think that while that degree of commitment and leaning in is admirable in spirit, the truth is that at an earlier stage we should have broadened responsibility. We did, in due course, with the setting up of the ministerial implementation groups, the Covid-19 task force and so on, but I do believe that should have happened earlier.
You've said that there may have been an element in the DHSC of we can do it.
Yes.
In Sir Patrick Vallance's diaries, that there are references to Mr. Hancock appearing to want to keep too much to himself. That in the face of the operational mess, as he describes it, into which the DHSC descended, there was a failure on Mr. Hancock's part and the part of the Permanent Secretary to tell the rest of government how it was. They kept too much to itself, or to themselves. Would you agree with that proposition?
Yes, but I think that, as I've just described, it was a desire to rise to the occasion and a wish to not evade responsibility, actually, on their part. But there should have been, arguably, a greater degree of challenge at an earlier stage. And it was the case that I'm sure others as well, used Cobras and used other opportunities, emails, messages, and so on, to try to ensure that the right questions were being asked and that DHSC, if it wasn't able to deliver in a particular area, sought the help of other government departments or had the oversight and scrutiny that other government departments could bring.
Regardless of their intentions, and they may have been honourable, you would agree that a failure to move fast enough, a failure to keep the rest of government informed as to the crisis faced by the DHSC was a significant failing in itself. That is not how the system is meant to work.
Well, I would take it one step back, which is that I think it is the case that there was a noble intention on the part of DHSC, but it is not as though DHSC was the sole repository of information about what was going on with the virus. One of the things that we were all doing was both listening to the thoughtful advice from the government's chief scientific advisor and the chief medical officer, but also seeing what was happening on our television screens, reading material that was open source and widely shared. So we could form a judgment about whether or not the whole government response and the DHSC response was appropriate. So again, we could make a judgment about the need for ventilators, seeing what was happening both in the Far East and in Italy. It should not have needed one single government department to prompt questioning from others within government about the approach that we were taking. And indeed, as I think my evidence points out, I benefited from reading outside government briefings in order to be able to bring to bear the sorts of questions which I believed it was necessary to ask.
Let us look then at some of the documents to which you were privy and the meetings which you attended in the early days of February 2020. Just by way of introduction to this topic and to explore your understanding as to what, in general terms, what general state the United Kingdom was in. Professor Sir Chris Whitty has stated that he was under no illusions that the United Kingdom was well set up to meet the challenges of a major pandemic, because he knew that investment in healthcare had been suboptimal. He knew that the pan-flu plans, such as they were, wouldn't necessarily stand up to the challenges of coronavirus. And of course, he was aware there was no sophisticated or scaled up test and trace and isolate system, in contradistinction to some other countries. In general terms, Mr. Gove, in early February, were you aware of those concerns? Was that a viewpoint that you shared? Were you under any illusions as to the general ability of the United Kingdom to respond to this crisis?
I think it was only later in February that I began to feel a sense of concern about how well prepared as a country we were. Prior to that, A, I didn't have the MCO responsibilities, but B, the general sense was that we were relatively well prepared as a country. Those were the assurances that we were being given across government. And I broadly took those on trust. I think there were some ways in which the government, as a result of exercises and steps that we'd taken beforehand, was, in a position to deal with aspects of the crisis. Other areas where we were clearly weaker. But no, I didn't have the prescience to see in early February that we were not well prepared. I think it was only later in February and early in March that my concerns about our response mounted.
Of course, there was no real change in relation to those deficiencies.
No.
The healthcare system was what it was. The pan-flu plans had been prepared in 2011 and had not been significantly altered. And there was no sophisticated, scaled-up TTI system. So to that extent, Mr. Gove, why were you not made aware of those salient features, those pre-existing aspects of the government's ability to respond?
I think because, again, I trusted, and I think others within government would have trusted the Department of Health and those with whom it worked in that area. Even after I took on MCO responsibilities, which was, as we discussed, in the middle of February, I could not immediately, I think, have scrutinised every single contingency plan across government and tested it with the rigour that might have been deserved.
Of course.
And of course, we were in the middle of an evolving crisis, and as I mentioned earlier, and as is well known, while the plan for pandemic flu that had been developed was, had many strengths and virtues, it was in the nature of the virus that we faced that it presented a different set of challenges from those that pandemic flu.
Indeed. But you would therefore accept that it turned out your trust in the system of government, your trust in, as you've described it, in the understanding that structurally the United Kingdom was well placed to meet the challenges of this new virus, were misplaced. It turned out we were not.
We were not as well prepared as we should have been, ideally. I think that is true. Again, it's in the nature of the fact that the virus was novel. And indeed, I think, though this probably goes beyond the remit of the inquiry, there is a significant body of judgment that believes that the virus itself was man-made. And that presents a set of challenges as well.
Forms no part of the terms of reference of this
Indeed.
inquiry, Mr. Gove, to address that somewhat divisive issue. So we're not going to go there.
But I think it is important to recognise that the virus presented a series of new challenges that required both the science to adjust, and science by definition adjusts on the basis of accumulating evidence both about the operation of the virus and its effect on particular elements within the population.
Well, we'll come to that quite separate issue in a moment. There was a cabinet meeting on the 6th of February, 56137. You were an attendee. We can see your name in the left-hand column on the first page. On page 6, there was a reference to a tabletop exercise. We should be able to see that reference, perhaps not on, therefore, on this page. Yes, there would be a tabletop exercise the following week. Colleagues should attend personally or designated junior minister as a dedicated departmental minister. That may have been, I think it probably was, Operation or Exercise Nimbus, which took place on the 12th of February. Did you attend Exercise Nimbus?
No.
What learning was communicated to you about the outcome of that tabletop exercise to which there'd been reference in Cabinet?
I do not recall any specific reference to exercise or Operation Nimbus. I do recall that after I acquired the responsibilities as MCO, a series of conversations with Catherine Hammond, the Director of the Civil Contingencies Secretariat, about some of the specific responsibilities that the Cabinet Office had. One thing I would say, which again goes to some of our earlier points, in the conversation that I had with Catherine, again, great public servant, quite a lot of the conversation was preoccupied with excess death management. Very sombre and important subject. The sense that I had was that the Civil Contingency Secretariat was dealing with those issues that other government departments felt they did not want to or should not be leading on. So it was dealing with, as it were, not the full sweep of questions that it should be dealing with. And I was struck by the fact that Cabinet Office, instead of assuming that broader coordinating role, which I would have assumed that it did, was instead being expected to deal with, admittedly, a hugely important section of our response rather than the whole of the response.
What other matters, what issues should it have been dealing with?
Well, my belief, and this is what eventually came to pass, is that it should have been the case that Cabinet Office should have been in a position with the resources and the structure in order to be able to more rigorously interrogate and then take control of the response to crises that other government departments, as lead government departments, had arrogated or had been allocated to themselves, or had been allocated, I should say.
And therefore, we may presume from your evidence that it did not do those things. Can I ask you what your understanding was in a very broad sense about the nature of the work done by the CCS? Because the material, as you rightly identify, shows that the CCS, the Civil Contingency Secretariat, was concerned with planning for excess death management.
Yes.
I mean, what a terrible euphemism.
Yes.
It was dealing with issues such as body bags.
Yes.
And the care for and the looking after of dead bodies.
Yes.
It was concerned with the promulgation of a pandemic, in fact, a flu pandemic bill. It was concerned with the surge capacity within the NHS and with the financing of the care sector.
Yes.
But there was no consideration of possible countermeasures at that stage, or in a broad sense of infection control matters.
Yes.
Is that the area to which you're referring when you say there were areas it didn't address?
A part of it, but it's even more a prior question, which is if you have a lead government department and the Secretary of State for that lead government department chairing COBRA, he's asking of other government departments for a variety of things. So if I were Secretary of State for Health and it were a pandemic, or if you were...
Could you just slow down a little bit, Mr. Gove? You're racing away now.
Give me. If either of us, if my lady were Secretary of State for Health and chairing COBRA, any of us would ask of other government departments what are you doing? So one would ask of the Education Minister, are we certain that policy X is being followed in schools? One would ask of the Defence Secretary, is it possible that we can deploy the military in this occasion? But the Health Secretary, him or herself, is not being questioned or held to account in that process. And I believe that that's the wrong model, that the Health Secretary or the Home Secretary, if it's a terrorist outrage, or the Environment Secretary, if it is a animal or plant disease outbreak, should not be the person chairing COBRA, but the person reporting to COBRA. And it should be a Cabinet Office Minister or the Prime Minister who acts as the chair, interrogating all government departments, seeking to ensure that ancillary departments support the lead department, but also questioning the lead department on its responsibilities and management.
Was there a specific issue in this regard in relation to the Health Ministerial Implementation Group? Because Mr. Hancock chaired that MIG and therefore was to some extent, in the way you've described, marking his own homework.
Yes, and I would say it is a structural weakness because, as I mentioned earlier, I have a high opinion of Mr. Hancock and believe that many of the decisions that he made were right and displayed foresight and wisdom.
You've acknowledged that when you discuss these issues with the Civil Contingency Secretariat,
Yes.
and we must presume from the fact that you said you approached them and you spoke to them that you were engaged in this issue, it was something that you were looking at. Was it apparent to you that there was no real debate about infection control being carried out within the CCS, that it was focusing on, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, ancillary issues such as
Yes.
the management of dead bodies, legislative proposals for dealing with public order in the face of a flu
Yes.
or coronavirus pandemic, and admittedly surge capacity within the NHS. In central government terms, there was no real consideration of how do we stop this virus from spreading, of what infection control measures need to be thought about and then put into place. What was your reaction?
Yes, I would not want to overstate either my knowledge or my prescience. All that I felt when I was talking to Catherine is, as you say, the whole issue of excess death management is sombre, chilling, scary. Also, why is this assuming so much of the Civil Contingencies Secretariat's time and time in this conversation when there are so many other aspects of dealing with this emerging pandemic that require to be addressed? What I could not say, because I did not know enough, is who's dealing with X, who's dealing with Y, who's dealing with the need for infection control, non-pharmaceutical interventions, therapeutics and so on, was something that I only became more acquainted with as the crisis developed.
In this cabinet meeting, you will see 2 or 3 lines above the reference to tabletop exercise. The words, the central point to make was that the government had a plan to deal with this illness, and this was guided by science.
Yes.
I don't intend to ask you any questions about the doctrine of following the science, but what was the plan, as far as you understood it, that the government had in place to deal with the illness? What plan? You must have asked yourself.
Yes, and the plan, and this was again emphasised in COBRA, was a plan to delay and contain the spread of the disease. The disease, however, overwhelmed that plan,
Yes.
to put it mildly.
How delay, how contain, Mr. Gove? What was the plan for delaying, for practically stopping the spread of the virus into the United Kingdom and then containing it thereafter to the extent that containment, delaying it thereafter to the extent containment was lost? What were the nuts and bolts of that plan, as far as you understood it to be?
that we should use testing and contact tracing in order to monitor the spread of the disease and that seek to isolate those who were infected.
You understood, of course, that that system dealt only with index cases, a relatively small number of travellers who had come into the United Kingdom, and that there was, beyond the first few hundred, absolutely no system for testing, tracing and isolating.
Quite. And not only was the system at that time proven to be inadequate and overwhelmed, there were subsequent problems with testing and contact tracing throughout the pandemic. I would only add, however, that the initial evidence that ministers were presented with was that there was a low likelihood of asymptomatic transmission, and obviously we subsequently discovered, we all discovered that was not the case.
That is to do with the overarching understanding of the characteristics of the virus, but focusing on what the Cabinet was told by the CMO about the nature of the plan. This was plainly a matter of the gravest concern, and you were being assured, don't worry, we've got a plan.
Yes.
And I want to ask you, what was your understanding of the mechanics of that plan beyond, well, we're going to contain it and delay it?
That principally, but also that we had, as Chief Medical Officer, one of Britain's foremost epidemiologists, that we had a robust system within the NHS of providing surge capacity at certain moments, and that we had stocks of some of the drugs that might prove efficacious and of PPE. Of course, it was in the nature of our preparation that our preparation was for a flu pandemic, and that the PPE and drugs that we had were aligned with that type of pandemic, not the coronavirus pandemic, as it turned out.
Even at that stage, Mr. Gove, it was known to everybody there was no antiviral or no therapeutic for this coronavirus. So that could have been of little solace. In terms of how it was envisaged that if the virus spread beyond the handful of travellers and index cases, infection control measures could be put into place, what debate was there?
That debate only intensified or really took place later.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. There was no debate about the nature, the existence of infection control measures at this stage in early February.
Well, there was an observation or a series of observations about what was being done in East Asian countries, and particularly in China. And again, a central question that I know many of us will be asked to address is the wisdom or efficacy of lockdown. But I think, as the CMO, CSA and others have said, lockdown was an unprecedented departure for a country like the United Kingdom with its traditions of liberty. Normally, it would be the case that those who were infected, and visibly so, would be isolated, not an entire population being locked down. It was a very, very significant step, I believe, right and justified given the nature of the virus, but nevertheless a momentous one. And again, we were looking at emerging evidence at that time. And again, I would stress that the burden of the advice that we were being given in early March was that thinking about locking down the population was not just a momentous step and a significant departure from what had gone before, but a policy that would have to be introduced with care, because we could not expect the UK population to endure those restrictions for too long.
We will return, of course, to the issue of lockdown. But for present purposes, it wasn't, of course, a decision that was made until the 23rd of March.
Indeed.
And not debated, in fact, at a serious and high level until probably 2 weekends before, the weekend of the 14th, 15th of March. You accept, therefore, Mr. Gove, that whilst debating the spread of a new coronal viral outbreak, acknowledging, as you have done already, that there was a dawning realization that there were no practical measures that could stop its spread, no TTI, sophisticated TTI system, that the virus, once it got out of China, would be impossible to be limited, to be kept away from our shores. There was no debate about infection control. Prosaically, how do we stop the virus from spreading throughout this land?
I would say two things. I'm sure there was debate going on in SAGE, in other government advisory committees, amongst medical experts, epidemiologists, and public health experts. I'm sure that debate was going on. I could only rely on the advice that was given to government ministers, broadly, and also to what you or I or anyone could read through open source information. And at the time, in public debate, there were not many voices who were urging the type of action that we subsequently embraced. And I think it was only because of the situation in Italy, in Lombardy, and the effect of lockdown there, that we had a real existing example in a Western European country of the application of the types of policies that we subsequently had to embrace. So I search in vain for the individual or individuals who, well in advance of early March, were clear about what was required. I think I mentioned in my evidence that the former Cabinet Minister, Rory Stewart, invoked the example of dealing with Ebola in calling for very firm measures. But I believe in Rory's case, I think one of the most prescient figures in the debate, that was only early in March that he was making that case. Admittedly, of course, and to be fair to him, he was, having been a government minister, also outside government.
You've referred, of course, to the outbreak in northern Italy. To get our chronological bearings, the first lockdown was imposed in northern Italy in 10 municipalities on the 21st of February. So we'll come back to this sometime before the comparable decision was taken here. And another document before the break, please. The Civil Contingencies Secretariat was tasked on the 25th of February with drawing up plans for central government for dealing with this coronavirus outbreak. And if we can have up, please, 146569, we can see a document dated the 28th of February, which was sent to the Prime Minister. We can see the reference in the top right-hand corner. Prime Minister, this is a short update paper on domestic plans on coronavirus. Attached is the full action plan Matt wants to publish on Tuesday, and which COBRA will review Monday. That's a reference to the action plan, which ultimately was published on the 3rd of March. If we could scroll back out, we can see, dated the 2nd of March, that the CCS is saying in paragraph 1, COVID-19 looks increasingly likely to become a global pandemic, although this is not yet certain. I'm not going to debate with you, Mr. Gove, when it became understood that there would be a global pandemic, but that was the position taken by the CCS. However, a global pandemic will require a step up in our response as we use additional legal powers, public messaging, and difficult policy decisions to delay the onset of any peak and mitigate the worst impacts. If we could scroll back out, we can see then in paragraph 3, preparations are well underway. COBRA is meeting regularly, and our best scientists are advising on when this step up will be needed. We need to share more of our planning. And then to get your bearings, if we could scroll back out on page 2 at 7, 8, and 9, we can see strategic and tactical aims set out. Protect lives, contain the infection, delay the peak. We need to strike a balance between taking precautionary steps and overreacting. So 2 questions, please. Were you privy to this document? Was this sent to you?
Well, I appear to be on the CC list, but
You do.
I am not certain. I would have to check with my office that I actually received this document in this form.
There was another variant of this document, of course, one without the note on the top, the
Yes.
handwritten note, which is why I've taken you to it.
Yes.
But do the best that you can then. There are repeated references to the preparation that would need to be done. A clear plan of activity will be required. And to the strategic and tactical aims. At this time, at the end of February, which is over a week after the lockdowns have been imposed in Italy, were you struck by the absence of detailed infection control plans, the practical measures which ultimately, of course, were imposed? Did it strike you that their omission from this core document from the Civil Contingency Secretariat was significant?
I think it was only a week after that, the week commencing the 9th or 10th of March, that my concerns began to mount significantly.
There's a reference to overreaction in paragraph 9. As cases spread across the world, the risk of overreacting is reducing. There was a meeting with the Prime Minister, which again you may not have attended, on that day, the 28th of February, and his private secretary's notebook refers to the fact that the Prime Minister stated the biggest damage would be done by overreaction.
Yes.
What was your view at this stage, around about the end of February, on the danger of overreacting?
I recognised the case. I do not believe that it was at the end of February. I believe that it was just a little bit later. As I say, on the week beginning the 9th or 10th of March, that I became convinced that the danger was underreacting, not overreacting. But I think that the Prime Minister's view that on past occasions we had seen, not so much foot and mouth, forgive me, Freudian slip, BSE, that we had seen an overreaction. I think his natural concern was that if we paralysed the economy, there would be undoubted costs. There were undoubted costs. And before taking such a grave step, we needed to be absolutely certain that it was justified. As I say, at the time, at this precise point, around the very end of February, I was inclined to give substantial weight to the Prime Minister's concerns. It was only in the succeeding days that I became more and more convinced, actually, that action was required. And that was partly because of what I had seen happening in Italy, partly also material that had been sent to me by friends outside government that led me to believe action was needed.
Milady, is that a convenient moment?
It is, certainly. Forgive me, 11:30, please. Mr. Keith.
Mr. Gove, during the course of the morning, I was asking you some questions about dysfunctionality at the heart of central government, in particular in some of its government departments. And I asked you, I said, I'm going to press you in relation to the areas in which you said it would be wrong to award yourself and the government high marks. And you said, I think it was the case that there were specific failings, and we can go on to list them. Rather rudely, I didn't ask you to list them. Could you list them, please?
I don't think I can exhaustively. I think that I believe that we were too slow to lock down initially in March. I believe that we should have taken stricter measures before we eventually decided to do so late in October. I believe that while it was admirable that we succeeded in building testing capacity so quickly, that the strategic approach to who should be tested and why and what our tests were for was not as rigorously thought through as it might have been. I am also concerned that we did not pay enough attention to the impact, particularly on children and vulnerable children, of some of the measures that we took. I also believe that the approach that we took towards PPE procurement deserves, at the very least, a reflection.
Thank you. On the 2nd of March, there was a COBRA. It was the first one chaired by the Prime Minister.
Yes.
56217. Do you believe that the Prime Minister should have chaired earlier COBRAs, not for the purposes of reaching a different outcome in terms of the work done by COBRA, Mr. Gove, but in terms of giving a greater impression that the crisis was being taken seriously? Or are you agnostic on this issue?
Not quite agnostic. In an ideal world, the Prime Minister or another minister who was not the Secretary of State for Health, this is not a personal comment about Hancock, simply about the role, as we discussed earlier, should have chaired it. But I do believe that the Prime Minister chairing it on Monday, the 2nd of March, was wise and right.
Page 5, paragraph 2. The Chair invited the Government Chief Medical Officer and the Government Chief Scientific Advisor to provide a situation update. The CMO said that contact tracing for the source of infection for the last 2 cases in the United Kingdom had not been successful, and that in both France and Germany there was now sustained community transmission. So this is the 2nd of March. It's about a week or 10 days after a lockdown has been imposed for the first time in the 10 municipalities in Italy. There have been cases within the United Kingdom since the beginning of January, the 30th and the 31st of January, in fact. And the COBRA, the primary crisis response body for the United Kingdom, is being told contact tracing for the source of infection for the last 2 cases has not been successful, and there is sustained community transmission in France and Germany. Did you, experienced Cabinet Office Minister as you were, understand that in effect containment had been lost, that the virus was here and was spreading?
Yes.
There was an action plan published the following day. You've referred to it later. Referred to it earlier. INQ 57508, the Coronavirus Action Plan. This was, and we'll come to this in a different context later in the course of your evidence, a document, a publication to which all the devolved nations had contributed. At page 10 on paragraph 3.9, there is set out the broad strategic approach to the United Kingdom government. Contain, detect early cases, follow up close contacts and prevent the disease taking hold in this country for as long as is reasonably possible. If it does take hold, slow the spread in the country. Did COBRA, which was cited, of course, on the publication of this action plan, consider the degree to which containment had already been lost, that the virus was in the United Kingdom and it was spreading, there was sustained community transmission, and therefore that a strategy based in part upon containment was a failed strategy?
I think it's fair to say that there was a dawning realization that the spread of the disease would mean that moving from contain to delay was becoming more and more imperative. Certainly on my part, and I'm sure on others.
Did anybody think to ask themselves, but what is the point of publishing our sole strategic document on a basis which may simply not turn out to be correct?
I think it was the case at that time that there was a growing realization, but it was not universal. This was a document, of course, agreed by all 4 governments, into which a degree of close working had gone. And this was the plan overall, as had been drawn up in the weeks and days beforehand. So I think it's fair to say that in laying out how the government sought and planned to approach the pandemic, that it was right to show our working, as it were.
On page 4 of paragraph 1.1, there is a reference to the United Kingdom being well prepared to respond in a way that offers substantial protection to the public. That turned out not to be the case, did it?
Certainly we were not well enough prepared, no.
Going back to the COBRA document the day before, the meeting of COBRA 56217, on page 5, paragraph 3, continuing, the CMO said that interventions to delay the spread of the virus must not be implemented too early in order to ensure maximum effectiveness. SAGE was looking at social distancing measures and exploring measures that both Hong Kong and Singapore had utilised. Now, of course, as it happened, you're well aware that on the 12th of March, the first countermeasures were ordered to be imposed. It was an order that those displaying symptoms of coronavirus had to self-isolate for 7 days. What was COBRA's position in relation to the CMO's suggestion that infection control measures, perhaps of that type, isolation, self-isolation, possibly hand washing, possibly social distancing, should not be imposed too early to ensure maximum effectiveness? Was there a debate about the good sense or otherwise in that proposal?
Not at that COBRA, no, that I recall. There was a, I believe, understandable respect for the CMO. As I mentioned earlier, Sir Chris is a very distinguished epidemiologist and dedicated public servant. And the view, the broad scientific consensus at that time was that to impose measures which we now know of as lockdown would have tested the patience of the public, that they would not have endured for long, and therefore they needed to be applied at just the right time.
This was not, with respect, a reference to lockdown, or at least not least lockdown, because it's measures for social distancing and exploring measures.
I think the reference to both Hong Kong and Singapore was clearly a reference to East Asian jurisdictions that had very, very tight measures analogous to lockdown.
Not just a lockdown, correct?
Not just, no.
Yes. So the CMO told COBRA that whatever these measures for social distancing were, they should not be imposed too early, and yes. COBRA accepted that proposition.
At the time, yes.
Page 6. There is a reference to next steps. Summing up, the chair said the government's response must be guided by science and protecting the vulnerable. The chair said that COBRA will continue to meet on a regular basis. Why was there no debate on the merit or efficacy of specific measures, perhaps of the type that the Chief Medical Officer had in mind?
Well, no such measures were put to COBRA at that time. I think that the CMO, I can't obviously know what all his thinking was, but I think the CMO was preparing us for the need for such measures in the future, rather than listing the sorts of measures that needed to be implemented with rapidity later.
Bluntly, why did no one on COBRA, the primary crisis response body for the United Kingdom government, say to the Chief Medical Officer, it's obvious containment is lost or is about to be lost. This fatal virus, to which there is no vaccine or antiviral, is here and it's spreading. What, in practice, needs to be done to prevent the spread of the virus throughout this population?
I think it was the case that we accepted the broad view at the time that from the CMO and others that there was a limit to what could be done to contain the spread. And the reason there was a limit is that lockdown measures or analogous measures were unprecedented in their application in the UK, and the public, as I mentioned earlier, would not endure them for long. So the argument at the time was such measures may well be required, but we have to be careful not to introduce them too early, because that will only mean that they will have to be lifted, and that will lead to a second wave.
Mr. Keith, I'm sorry to interrupt. I hope I haven't stopped your train of thought. Going back to the reference to the Chief Medical Officer's advice to COBRA, I can't remember, forgive me, and I haven't got my notebook with me, whether that passage was put to Sir Chris and whether he accepted it was a fair reflection, because it seemed to me that he appeared to be advising caution against any measures, including lockdown, and we can understand the reasons in relation to lockdown. And I just wondered if...
Yes, indeed, the general proposition was put to him, but not that sentence. So my lady's quite right. There is an issue as to whether or not measure meant measures or it meant the lockdown measure.
Exactly, or whether it meant things short of lockdown, like
Yes.
social distancing.
Yes.
Yes.
Obviously, I'm not in a position to give evidence, and of course I can't. You have received a fair amount of material already as to what the general state of play was about the understanding of what measures might in due course be imposed. So I think a sensible place to land in relation to this is that no part of government was saying these are the lists of these are the lists of measures which you need to be considering. There was a general sense of be careful.
It's just that Mr. Gove just said that the public might get tired of them. Well, things like washing hands, we know that has no downside. And so I just wondered whether...
Indeed.
Can you remember, Mr. Gove, did the CMO cover up the broad spectrum of measures, or was your impression he was talking about measures as draconian as lockdown?
I think that he was preparing us for the possibility that there might need to be draconian measures, hence the reference to Hong Kong and Singapore. But at that stage, the broad advice was, as my lady says, to wash one's hands. To jump ahead slightly, and it may not be helpful, I believe that Cabinet met the following Tuesday, on the 10th of March. And in the Cabinet minutes, a point is recorded as having been made. I believe this is a reference to a question or a point that I asked then. I, by that stage, was concerned that the measures we were taking were not sufficient, that the hand-washing advice, while obviously valuable in itself, was not enough. And I think the Cabinet minutes record my saying that we needed to look at what other countries were doing, and we needed to be clear that there was a potential divergence of scientific opinion that needed to be taken account of. I wanted to balance both respect for the CMO and CSA. They're distinguished scientists, I'm not, but with a desire to say we do need to recognise that the course that we are on needs to be altered.
And of course, advice is advice, as the scientists and the CMO himself and the GCSA have been at pains to tell the inquiry. The ultimate decision makers were COBRA and, of course, above COBRA, ministers, and above ministers, the Prime Minister. But one final question on this point, and it's a question prefaced in my lady's question to you.
Yes.
There was a general understanding, of course, that there were measures available. In past pandemics, there have been the closure of schools. There has been hand washing, as my lady says. There are quarantines which have been contemplated and imposed in the past. Self-isolation of not just individuals, but households. Indeed, the very measures which did come to be imposed at a later stage. There just doesn't appear to be any debate at all about the nature of those measures, whether it was lockdown or any of these other well-understood measures. Do you agree?
Not that week, but the next.
No. And of course, you did have a growing concern, as you said in your statement, about whether or not tougher measures were required, and that goes to the same point. On the 10th of March, you emailed Mr. Hancock and Mr. Cummings 263380, and you detailed a list of questions that you required answers to. Just following up from Cobra yesterday, I think the DHSC team are doing a great job, but I want to follow up on some of what was being discussed yesterday. And you raise a number, if I may observe, of very good questions. You ask about resilience and the food and hospitality sector, what to do about people who've got mild symptoms, ICU capacity, equipment, over the page. Education, 111 calls, hospital organisations, screening, temperature screening, ditto and public gathering. I'm all for schools staying open. But what is the published scientific reasoning of, say, Spain that suggests they may have the closure of schools in Madrid wrong? We must, of course, be guided by science, but that involves testing the propositions and weighing up different choices, cognizant of the fact that, of course, advice is advice and you are the decision makers. These questions, Mr. Gove, appear to indicate that you were raising them because they had not been properly ventilated in Cobra. They were not being properly addressed by government, which is why you were reduced to writing to Mr. Hancock and Cummings directly and saying, what about these issues? Why had the system required you to have to take this step?
I think, in fairness, the email followed on from a Cobra discussion in which some of these issues...
It did. I read out the first line, following the Cobra yesterday.
Yes. And so I had a chance to reflect on some of the discussions that we'd had then, and these were questions consequent on that. It will often be the case that in a Cobra or a Cabinet Committee meeting, certain issues will be raised, and then as I have a chance to reflect afterwards, other questions occur to me which need to be addressed to follow up, and it seemed to me the most timely and efficacious way of driving change was to email both the Health Secretary and the Prime Minister's Principal Advisor direct, and again, both at the beginning and at the end, I stress that some of these questions may already have been addressed, and therefore, if what I'm saying is superfluous or off-beam, I apologise, because I recognise that there would be activity going on within the Department of Health and indeed decision-making within Number 10 that I might not be cited on.
Mr. Gove, none of these questions are formulated in terms of the point was made yesterday or something was said yesterday, and I just want to follow up with a question. It is this. These are all, if I may say so, very good but obvious questions, concerns that you've got. There is nothing here that suggests that they were debated in detail or at all the day before. Specifically, each of these questions.
Many of them were, including, as I mentioned, the 111 line and equipment overall. Because both Dominic Cummings and Matt Hancock were in the meeting, I would not have needed to have said in the email, as we discussed, or this issue was raised. I don't believe all of the questions that I ask followed on from everything that was discussed in the meeting. I think there are one or two that occurred to me because of other concerns that I had as more material became apparent to me.
275436 is a WhatsApp group concerning yourself and Mr. Cummings. If you can have page 3. Michael Gove at the top, and then there are references to Dom, obviously Dom Cummings. At 1948, on the 4th of March, so 2 days after the Cobra, you know me, I don't often kick off, but we're fucking up as a government and missing golden opportunities. I will carry on doing what I can, but the whole situation is even worse than you think, and action needs to be taken or we'll regret it for a long time. Expand, please.
I was concerned at that stage about the ability and structure of the Cabinet Office overall to deliver on the government's priorities. COVID was in my mind, but it wasn't the principal thing that I was messaging about. It was about the Cabinet Office overall, including its ability to deal with COVID. I apologise to you and to the inquiry and to the public for expressing myself in the way that I did. I'm sure that you'll understand that this sort of thing happens.
Well, speaking for my part, no apology is required. But the point is, Mr. Gove, you are obviously concerned about the general position of the government. And
Yes.
on the 4th of March, what
Yes.
was the most pressing concern of government?
Well, it was the coronavirus, but I was concerned about the Cabinet Office overall. I don't want to suggest that I was a perfect clairvoyant, very far from it. But it was the case, and I think I also emailed Mr. Cummings around this time as well to point out some of what I believed were the defects in the way in which the Cabinet Office operated. And I made the point then that the situation with coronavirus would only further expose the weaknesses in how the structure of government was set up.
On 11/03/2020, 1853/45, Mr. Cummings refers to the Cabinet Office in terms in which he has, in fact, repeatedly referred
Yes.
to it. But he says this: they told us they had plan. And you say, indeed. What plan? A plan for what, Mr. Gove?
I believe that Dom was referring then to a plan for the pandemic.
Right. You were the Cabinet Office Minister on the 11th of March, on the breaking of the coronavirus wave upon this country. You're speaking to the Prime Minister's chief advisor, and you are agreeing that the Cabinet Office appears to have a deficient plan or no plan for addressing this unprecedented crisis. That is a terrible state of affairs, is it not?
It is a deeply regrettable state of affairs. I mentioned earlier that on assuming responsibility overall for the Cabinet Office, I sought to initiate change. And as I say, I assumed responsibility on the 13th of February and then immediately sought to recruit additional personnel from within and without the civil service to support change, ordered a zero-based review of the Cabinet Office, asked for an improved analytical function. And as the first WhatsApp of the 4th of March indicates, I wanted to alert Dom to what I consider to be the scale of change necessary.
Page 4. There is a reference to act today. Yes, at 12:03, 12th of March, 2300, 11 o'clock at night. I've now lost, yes, at the bottom of the page. If you could scroll back out, please. There we are. Michael Gove, you send to Mr. Cummings a link for what appears to be an article or an op-ed or piece of information entitled "Act Today or People Will Die."
Yes.
You were under no illusions about the seriousness of the government's position, were you?
No.
You were concerned that were not more stringent steps to be taken and were the government not to act more speedily, people would die.
Yes.
All right.
And in particular, the reference to that article by Thomas Pueyo the article had been sent to me by friends who worked outside government.
You mentioned that earlier, that you had been provided with information from outside government. But was this material that friends had sent you in relation to a possible response to the coronavirus crisis or related to steps that the government believe should be taking?
Thomas Pueyo's article was intended to act as a wake-up call to governments across the West. And so it wasn't specific to the UK, but the arguments that he made about coronavirus weighed with me. I'd read other material beforehand that had provoked concern, but this seemed to me to be the best, clearest, and most urgent expression of the need to act of anything that I had read, and I wanted to make sure that it was shared across government so that people could see essentially the reasoning that had reinforced my conviction that we needed to act.
This is not a hindsight debate, is it? Your friends and your colleagues outside government were sending you material imploring the government, or imploring you to act. they were doing so on the basis of information material which was available to them and no doubt in large part publicly available. Is that correct?
Yes, and I deliberately sought information from friends outside government whose opinion I trusted, because I wanted to make sure that I had alternative sources of information to test the views that were being expressed by government colleagues and others.
Yes. Evidence has been given to the inquiry to the effect that there was, over the weekend of Saturday the 14th and the 15th of March, a change in strategy.
Yes.
Regardless of whether it was a real change in strategy or whether it was a scaling up of an existing strategy, and whether or not there is a distinct conceptual difference between mitigating the impact of a virus and suppressing it. What, in your view, was the driver for that change in approach, that dawning realization over that weekend? Was it the information from SAGE in relation to the workings of and the work done by Imperial College and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine? Was it the CMO? Was it Mr. Cummings and Mark and Ben Warner and Helen McNamara and Imran Shafi, who had met to discuss the crisis and their understanding of the emergency? What was the push? Where was it coming from?
Well, I think the fact that you cite so many examples shows that there was a convergence of thinking in different institutions from different individuals about the need to act. I was not aware of Neil Ferguson's work until after that weekend. In fact, I don't think it was shared publicly until after that weekend. A great deal of weight has been placed on Professor Ferguson's work as influencing government decision-making. I think it's fair to say that I and others had come to these conclusions before that. What weighed with me were the numbers.
Why was the drive such that it was, or the dawning realization on the part of the various parts of government and the people within it, not coming from the DHSC, the Department of Health, the lead government department responsible for health?
I do believe that that weekend, as I recall, the Secretary of State for Health was also, like me, keen on the exercise of greater caution when it came to dealing with the virus, and was, like me, I believe, an advocate for very uncomfortable restrictions on civil liberty in order to deal with the health emergency.
The Secretary of State himself engaged in what became, of course, the lockdown debate and the need for more stringent measures. But why wasn't institutionally the DHSC, its officials, its advisors, its civil servants, responsible at that stage, the lead government department for the response to the crisis, not driving the government machine forward to this conclusion?
I believe it was the case that the Secretary of State and others within DHSC would have been pressing upon Number 10 and the Prime Minister the need to act at that time as well.
Well, I'm afraid I need to press you. You say you believe. Have you seen emails or communications from the DHSC institutionally to the Prime Minister saying, we're behind the curve, we've missed a trick here, we are delayed, and there is an urgent need for more stringent measures, and we need a change in strategy?
No, but my recollection of the conversations that I had around that time was that the Secretary of State was of that view. And I should say that I'm pretty certain that he would have communicated that in conversation with the Prime Minister. But again, I would not have been in all of those conversations. And one of the reasons why I texted and emailed as I did was to alert people to my concerns and to hope that if they were, as I believe both Dominic Cummings and Matt Hancock were, if they were of similar mind, to feel strengthened in their desire to push forward with these restrictions, because they would know that they had my support.
On the 12th of March, as we know, there was self-isolation for individuals
Yes.
who were symptomatic for 7 days. After the weekend, on the 16th of March, Cobra decided that there needed to be further more stringent measures. And you'll recall the household
Yes.
isolation for 14 days, reduced contact, advice over 70s particularly must ensure that they reduce contact.
Yes.
And there was a warning about the need to move to shielding imminently. On the 18th, Cobra decided to close schools from the 20th, just in very general terms, Mr. Gove. Did you have any direct dealings with the Prime Minister during the course of that week as to whether or not those more stringent measures needed to be applied? I ask you this because the evidence from Mr. Cummings has been that there was a widespread view, he said pretty much everyone considered the Prime Minister to be oscillating, not using his word, but that's the sense of it, in relation to his response. What was your assessment of the Prime Minister's intent, state of mind as to whether these measures should be countenanced?
I think the Prime Minister found these decisions difficult. It's not that he found decision-making difficult. It is that a decision to restrict freedoms in an unprecedented way went against his instincts and the principles that governed his political outlook. The Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Johnson, was someone who was a liberal in so many senses, and certainly someone who found the idea of restricting free association deeply difficult, deeply opposed to his worldview, and therefore, as I think everyone knows, to contemplate such a big measure with the inevitable costs was a decision of huge weight. I believe that the evidence was clear that such a decision was unavoidable.
Again, I'm sorry to interrupt. You say decision. You appear to be relating your answer, therefore, to the lockdown decision. I'm asking about the stringency of the measures during the course of that week.
I think that almost every restriction of liberty, including the closure of schools, was one that the Prime Minister would instinctively have felt unhappy with. I don't think any of these decisions were taken lightly. In terms of the Prime Minister's decision-making style, the oscillation referred to, it's in the nature of the way that Boris Johnson worked that he wanted to see thesis, antithesis. That he preferred gladiatorial decision-making rather than inquisitorial. He wanted to see the two cases, or the three cases, rehearsed in front of him, or even rehearsed in his own mind. And I know that he would sometimes run argument A and articulate it himself, and then run argument B and articulate it himself in order to weigh in his mind which was the stronger argument. Now, for some people, that style of decision-making or that way of running meetings was difficult to take. But I'd known the Prime Minister for some time and appreciated this was the way he needed to process information in order to get to an outcome. And every political leader, every distinctive political leader, will have their own way of operating that needs a certain amount of space and respect, even if you disagree with their conclusions.
This was a public health emergency at its core. By that week, the evidence, or rather the advice from SAGE, from the CMO, the GCSA, from the DHSC, from Cabinet Office, from Number 10, was, to use your word, unanimous. There was no real argument as to whether, for good and obvious public health reasons, these measures had to be contemplated. They were matters of life and death. So there wasn't really a thesis and antithesis position here, Mr. Gove. All the public health advice on a public health crisis was pointing in one direction. So on what basis could the Prime Minister push back and say, well, I've got material which does point the other way? There was no public health material pointing the other way. What's that?
Well, the first thing is that just a few weeks beforehand.
No, I'm not beforehand. I'm not talking about that week.
Oh no, quite. But in order, as your evidence shows, I was in a different position at that time to the Prime Minister. However, in fairness to him, just a few weeks beforehand, the point had been made that to impose these measures was
Too early.
Yes, was problematic. And I think he is the ultimate decision maker, and therefore I think any Prime Minister, is entitled to test propositions and to think, is the restriction of liberty and the economic damage consequent upon lockdown worth inflicting on people in order to prevent the spread of this virus? I believe that the evidence was clear, but I think it only fair to the ultimate decision maker that they have a chance to reflect on the momentous nature of the decision and to consider arguments against it.
I need to suggest to you, because of the material which has been received and the evidence which has been given, that it wasn't just a question of testing the opposing argument. The material was, as I've suggested to you, and of course it's a matter for you, all one way in public health terms. The suggestion has been made that he didn't just test the opposing arguments. He was incapable of making a decision, or at least not sticking to a decision that he had already made. Is that a fair suggestion, would you say, in light of your experience and your closeness to the government machine at that time?
No. On this occasion, I believe that it was a reluctance to embrace a decision rather than an inability to stick to one. Because again, as we discussed, the Prime Minister had a view that overreaction was often a greater danger. He also had a principled attachment to maximising individual liberty. Therefore, it was difficult for him, both from the point of view of his outlook on how to handle crises and the set of principles by which he guided his political life, it was difficult for him to contemplate something like this, especially when we had been told, as I say, just weeks beforehand, that these were measures that should only be applied for a limited period and at the right time. So the Prime Minister eventually concluded this was the right thing to do. I believe that that ultimate decision was right, and I believe that he made the case for it in public well. If it took him a little longer to come to that conclusion than others, we can consider the impact of that, but I don't think it was the case that he was oscillating. I think it was the case that he was weighing things before coming reluctantly but firmly to a conclusion.
And this, may we presume, doesn't derogate from your earlier evidence, the effect that the government machine as a whole may nevertheless have acted too slowly. Personally, as the Prime Minister, you believe, took the decision, the ultimate decisions in that week and the week after, timelessly.
Yes, and again, the Prime Minister is the ultimate decision maker, but no Prime Minister takes decisions in a vacuum. My view, it is with the benefit of hindsight, is that we should have acted earlier, but that means it is incumbent on all of us who believe that to look back and think, did we say or do enough sufficiently early in order to enjoin upon the Prime Minister the need for action? I mentioned, for example, briefly, Rory Stewart earlier, whom I believe was present. But Rory was only calling for the sorts of steps that we required in public on the 12th of March. Again, he was making it clear that we needed to act that day. That was the same day I shared the Thomas Pueyo article privately. So the consensus for action became firmer and clearer in that second week of March, with the benefit of hindsight, if only it had been firmer and clearer in all our minds earlier.
Yes.
But I don't think that one can single out the Prime Minister at the time for criticism. We all deserve our share, retrospectively, of criticism.
You chaired the COBRA on Friday the 20th of March.
Yes.
Could we have 106-263, which is a paper on additional measures? These are the measures which were put in place on that 20th to try to achieve the overarching objective of a 75% reduction in non-essential social mixing. If we just look very briefly at page 1, paragraphs 2 to 4, we can see that there's a general position on compliance set out. And there's the history of the government steps are set out from Monday the 16th of March. If you could scroll back out to paragraph 3, there is a reference to latest public polling data, which shows the number of people who claim to be engaging in social distancing behaviours. And then over the page 4, paragraph 4, the mixed picture means there is merit in considering further measures to increase compliance. There's a reference to overnight polling. And then, as such, it is proposed that measures apply to the whole United Kingdom. There were some positive indications. If we go back to the first page, it's obvious, Mr. Gove, that tube travel was down, West End footfall was down, Google Place data showed significant drops. So the position on the Friday appeared to be, is this correct, that there was significant material showing that compliance was up, but it was just not enough. It hadn't reached, in broad terms, the 75% reduction in social distancing that was required. Just as a general proposition, is that right?
Absolutely.
All right. Why didn't COBRA consider expressly waiting to see whether or not the measures which had been put in place on Monday the 12th would have effect over a longer time period? There is an acceptance that it's not good enough. But why could COBRA not have waited? And by extension, by analogy, why could not the ultimate decision on Monday the 23rd have been delayed a bit more to see whether or not these compliance figures would continue to go in the right direction and reach the right levels?
Because the virus was spreading exponentially, and the risk was that the NHS would be overwhelmed.
We'll come to look at the NHS in a moment, but was there debate on the Friday about the hard data presented in relation to the impact on the NHS, hard data relating to the likely mortality rates that would continue to go up if the measures were not imposed, and on the need or the possibility of waiting further? The inquiry well understands exponential growth. And evidence has been given by Professor Sir Chris Whitty as to what it means in practice.
Yes.
Unless you get on top of exponential growth, it will continue, and it will continue relentlessly until the country is completely overwhelmed, and the death mortality rates are absolutely intolerable. But it is a curve. It is a degree. Why was there not more debate about the alternative of waiting to see whether or not this would work?
Because those of us who were taking decisions understood where we were in terms of the growth of the virus. The whole point about exponential growth is, as we know, is the famous analogy of a grain of rice on the first corner of a chessboard. By the time that you get to the final other corner of the chessboard, then you are talking in terms and in numbers literally unimaginable. So therefore, as you move from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 and so on, if you leave it for another day or another week, the numbers are so significant and so huge that you know that you have left it too late. And as Chris Whitty and Dame Angela McLean made clear, the measures that you take have a time lag before they begin to take effect. So you have the curve going up and up and up, and the measures not beginning to take effect for some time. So therefore, you do need to hit the curve at the earliest possible point when you know that growth is exponential.
You all knew that there was exponential growth. That is the nature of this virus. Once control has been lost, it will spread inevitably exponentially. And you knew that on the 12th of March when the first measures were imposed, and on the 16th of March, and then on the 20th of March.
Yes.
But notwithstanding your understanding of the risks of exponential growth, you were still prepared as a government to try those measures. You didn't say on the 12th and the 16th, well, the central feature of exponential growth is it's going to be terrible and it will overwhelm us unless we have a lockdown. You were prepared to countenance measures short of a lockdown. Why didn't you give longer for those measures to work on the premise that on the 12th and the 16th of March, you knew you were dealing with an exponential crisis already?
I think it was the case that both in the communications that I had with people on the 12th and also, as I think Imran Shafi's notes of the meetings that occurred that weekend show, I was pressing at the time for the most vigorous action as early as we possibly could.
Can I interrupt you there? Are you saying, therefore, that you would have countenanced and you believed that it was appropriate to impose a lockdown perhaps on the 16th or the 20th of March?
Oh, yes.
Right. And what about the week before?
Well, I came to the conclusion during the week, as I mentioned, of the 9th, 10th March, that it was necessary. And as I say, the Thomas Pueyo article, I think, crystallized that imperative in my mind more than perhaps anything.
Do you call in the Cobra meetings that you chaired and attended in the week of the 16th of March for a lockdown to be imposed that day?
I don't believe that I did, but I do believe that my communications to other decision makers shows the position that I took, but I would not have wanted to, given that the nature, certainly when I chaired Cobra, was to act as a chair rather than an instigator or an advocate. My instinct would have been, and at that point, to seek consensus and to give effect to collective government policy.
Just to go, sorry to interrupt, you've obviously referred to the article that had some influence on you by the sounds of it. Did you have access to other material from, for example, scientists who advised against a lockdown? Did you get that kind of material to consider?
Later on, yes. I mean, I paid attention to the arguments put forward by people like Carl Hennigan and the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration and others. I think that obviously their point of view I respect, but the propositions that they put forward I think were just undeliverable. The idea that we could shield the elderly and allow young people free rein, I think given the nature of multi-generational households and so on, they would not have been effective in mitigating the virus. The second thing is that quite a lot of people have understandably said Sweden managed these things better. But again, the public, many of those who advocate that we should have gone down the Swedish route misunderstand what Sweden did. Sweden was able to reduce social mixing by a greater degree of reliance on wide societal acceptance of those restrictions. We, as this Cobra paper points out, were seeking societal, compliance with those measures, but we knew that would not be enough and it was too late. And indeed, as I think the evidence of the inquiry points out, Anders Tegnell himself, when he was invited to speak to the Prime Minister, said, you should act. So again, people, I understand how this happens, having been a journalist, people in the media will sometimes paint a picture of what's happening in order to create a greater sense of drama or divergence. So Sweden, libertarian nirvana, Britain, lockdown dystopia. Actually, the approach taken by both countries was more similar than many would like to admit. Another point as well, if I may, people also sometimes make the argument that there was a tension between the economy and health. Now, obviously, lockdown creates problems for the economy. But, as I subsequently wrote in an article in the Times to explain our reasoning, if we had allowed the pandemic to develop without taking the steps that we did, the NHS would have been overwhelmed, and that would have meant an impact on economic activity far greater than that we had to endure. So when people talk about the trade-off between the economy and health, when you have the virus, you need to respond in a way that protects both the health service and the health of the nation and the economy.
Can I ask you, just for the few remaining questions on this subject, to focus on that week of the 16th of March?
Of course.
You said when you chaired COBRA, your position was that you should act as a chair rather than as an instigator or an advocate. You wanted to seek consensus. The material, Mr. Gove, shows quite clearly that over the weekend of Saturday, the 14th of March, and also latterly in October, November, and then again in December, you made no bones at all about the need for the particular measure under consideration, ultimately lockdowns 2 and 3. You made your position on what should be done perfectly plain. Having acknowledged that your own view was that a lockdown was required to be imposed in the week of the 16th of March, why did you, in these COBRA meetings, one of which you chaired, not say, I, Michael Gove, believe the only way forward, the only sensible route is a lockdown now to save lives?
I believed that I had communicated my views clearly in every forum where I could. It's in the nature of ministerial life that sometimes you chair a meeting of a subcommittee or a cabinet committee, and your job there is to act as the neutral chair seeking consensus. Then sometimes you are an advocate for a particular position, your own departmental position or your own deeply felt position. And I had been asked by the Prime Minister to chair that COBRA, and I was acting, as it were, under instructions. And I felt that that was the right thing to do to serve the government collectively. Again, it's,
In hindsight, do you regret that you were not more forthright in what you plainly and genuinely believe was the right course of action to take?
Generally, people have always been unhappy when I've been more forthright in the past. But on this occasion, I should definitely have been more forthright.
This was a matter of life and death.
Absolutely. And that is why I believe that I should have been.
Thank you. The decision to implement the national lockdown was, of course, taken on that Monday. And there was a COBRA. Could we just very briefly look at 56213, which is the minutes of that meeting? Just by way of quick observation, if we look at the first page, we can see, of course, that there are a number of ministers there. Over the page, I should say, Mr. Gove, that minute doesn't reflect your attendance, but you believe you were there.
I believe I was, yes.
Over the page, we can see officials dialed in, and then on page 4, paragraphs 1 to 3, we can see the current situation update. And there is more information given about compliance. It wasn't too bad, as with the COBRA on the Monday, compliance was there in large part, but the park attendance over the weekend had shot up. You can see that in paragraph 3. Standing back, this penultimate decision-making body, obviously the Prime Minister had the whip hand, but this penultimate decision-making body discussed compliance rates. But there was very little by way of debate over the economic and societal harm that would be necessarily done if these measures were to be imposed, over the terrible balancing exercise inherent in that decision. But also, again, no discussion at all as to whether or not more time should be given for the measures which Cobra, had imposed the very week before on the Friday, 3 days before. Why was there not more debate about waiting to see whether or not those other measures, earlier measures, which by implication must have been sensible and well-judged measures, could be taken to have effect?
Well, again, it was clear, certainly to me, that those measures had been inadequate. I think at the time that I was sceptical that they would be enough, but understood why people thought that this was proportionate. By definition, when you're dealing with any sort of crisis, you use whatever data comes to hand, whatever feedback there is, in order to adjust your response. Sticking inflexibly to a set of measures when those measures are clearly inadequate would be an error.
But why were they inadequate? If only 3 days had passed and compliance was going up, just not fast enough.
Well, quite.
Why were they inadequate? Might they not have become adequate 2 days hence?
I think you have answered your own question. That compliance was not going up fast enough and that more evidence was accumulating about the spread of the virus.
Well, no, you knew already it was an exponential spread. You didn't know any more about what the ultimate outcome would be because that rested upon whatever decisions you might take on that Monday. But the basic feature hadn't altered. It was still an exponential growth.
Yes.
You'd put measures in place which you in good faith believed would do the trick. And only 3 days had passed, one weekend, before you then moved to the next ultimate level, a lockdown.
Yes. And as we've discussed, my view was sterner measures earlier. And I think both the accumulating evidence but also the force of argument made it clear that more action was required. So if the conclusion that you're seeking is, did we adopt measures knowing that they were inadequate? I profoundly feared they would not be enough. But, of course, in any debate within government, you make your case and accept that you will not always prevail.
Finally, on this topic, the NHS. There's very little debate in the Cobra of that day, the penultimate decision-making body, about the impact on the NHS. And in light of the time, I'm not going to take you through all the material. Well, perhaps we could just have up on the screen a summary of the material referring to the likely impact on the NHS. It's 274026. If we just very shortly look at this document, 274026, and scroll through to this time, which is around about the 21st, 22nd, 23rd of March, so pages 5 or 6. There are, perhaps one more page, there are multiple references to the likely impact on the NHS being either overwhelmed or overtopped or collapse.
Yes.
And then if we go forward one page, on the 8th of page 8, we can see on the 21st of March at a COVID meeting, the Chief Medical Officer gives figures about how ITU in London might be overwhelmed. If you go forward one page further, the Chief Executive of the NHS responds, dealing with the worsening situation, but how the NHS is aiming for more ventilated beds, more surge capacity, how it's going to make more hospitals available, and so on and so forth. And then over one more page to the 22nd and the 23rd of March, references to a major drive to free up capacity. Occupancy now at the lowest than in more decades. Continuing at the bottom of the page, planning for ramping up ventilators, and then finally over one page to page 11. I'm sorry, it's rather a long question. References to doubling to the risks that the NHS would not cope. So, in light of all that, two questions, please. Firstly, to what extent did that COBRA body on the Monday look at the hard data relating to the actually anticipated impact upon the NHS, the figures, the ICU beds, the ventilators, and so on? Or did COBRA just assume that if it didn't act in the way that it advised, the NHS would just bluntly collapse?
Several things. Firstly, one did not need to know the precise nature of capacity within the NHS to be influenced by the broad argument that continued exponential growth would overwhelm it.
Right.
By definition, there would be a level of growth that almost no health system could have coped with if the virus was left unchecked or if inadequate measures had been put in place. Both before and after, I and other ministers sought information and were informed about the precise nature of the capacity constraints within the NHS. And again, when we talk about beds, we have to recognise that for intensive care beds, you need not just equipment, but trained individuals, doctors, nurses, others. So NHS capacity constraints are driven by the number of specialists and by the equipment, as well as by physical capacity as well. We may go on to talk about the Nightingale hospitals that were built. While it was an amazing feat, I think the inference that some people drew was that you could somehow magic up significant additional capacity with the NHS at rapid speed. The truth, of course, is that what you're fundamentally relying on is not just ventilator capacity, but the capacity of trained clinicians.
Staff. I don't wish to get into the debate about the actual mechanics, the operating mechanics of the NHS. The question is this. There was, it appears, a general assumption that if these steps were not taken, the final step of the lockdown was not taken, then on account of exponential growth, the NHS would ultimately, at some unknown point in the future, collapse.
Yes.
There was no alternative in that sense. What debate was given as to the difference, the distinction between the likely impact on the NHS under the Friday the 20th measures as opposed to the lockdown measure being advocated on the Monday? Did anybody in COBRA say, well, hang on, what will be the practical difference in terms of the impact on the NHS of this final step as opposed to the measures which you imposed on the Friday?
As I recall, I think everything revolved around whether or not we could suppress the growth of the virus or whether the virus would continue to grow exponentially. If you suppress the growth of the virus, reduce R below 1, then you can begin to see at some point the curve coming down and the pressure removed or at least reduced on the NHS. If it goes up, i.e. if you're not managing to take R down below 1, then sooner or later, the NHS will be overwhelmed until you get it back below 1.
And so are you saying then that what COBRA concluded was that only this final ultimate step would suffice to bring the R rate below 1, that you couldn't gamble that the earlier measure on the Friday would be sufficient?
Yes.
You had to take that final step because only that would give you the sufficient degree of sureness that you were doing everything you could to bring R below 1.
Exactly.
Right. Can we now then turn, please, to an entirely different subject, which is the structures within government for responding to the crisis, because you became chair of what was then known as COVID-0. And also, I want to look at the degree to which you liaise with the devolved administrations, which is another extremely important issue. I'm just going to try to summarise the position structurally, and if you just indicate whether or not you agree, and then we can move on swiftly to the nub of the issue. COBRA, the devolved administration health ministers attended initial COBRA meetings. Then, of course, the First Ministers attended, Mr. Drakeford from the 18th of February, the remainder from the 2nd of March. Is that correct? You attended 16 COBRAs between March 20 and February 22. You sent a note to the Prime Minister on the 30th of November 2020 highlighting the shortcomings of the COBRA machinery. I think you've been forced out of COBRA because the video technology didn't work.
Yes.
Just this simple question, please. Had there been any changes to the machinery within COBRA, within the corridor and the rooms, or the rooms particularly in the Cabinet Office, between March, when the crisis crashed upon this country, and November, when you wrote that note to the Prime Minister about the shortcomings in the machinery? Had there been changes? Had the room been updated at all?
I think there were some changes, and I thought I'd have to check. COBRA can refer both, please forgive me, to one single physical room, but also to the act of convening people. And I'm not sure how much I can say, actually. But there is more than one COBRA room.
Yeah, the inquiry understands that. Were there significant changes to the machinery, the data links, the video
Insufficient.
and so on? No, were there changes between March and November?
I believe there were, but they were clearly insufficient.
Right. You took part in what was called the Quad. That was a group of ministers comprising the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Hancock and yourself in the early part of the crisis. From March, there was instituted the 9:15 meetings in Downing Street, which were chaired by the Prime Minister. Is that correct?
Yes.
They took place between the 17th of March and the 15th of May. You note in your statement that those meetings were important, but there was a limit on what they could do because of the exigencies of time, the need to update the Prime Minister, deal with the daily events of government and so on. Then you chaired what was known as the General Public Services Ministerial Implementation Group, the GPS MIG. And that was convened between March and May, correct?
Yes.
You raised in emails to other ministers and to the Cabinet, Mark Sedwell in the Cabinet Office, your concerns about whether or not the right governance structures were in place. And in part, as a result of your raising of those concerns about the MIGs, in May, the MIGs were done away with, and there was then a system known as Covid-S and Covid-O. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did you have, in March 2020, email correspondence with an advisor in Downing Street called Munira Mirza, who I think was in charge of the policy team there, about the way in which the MIGs were operating, in particular the health MIG, which was being chaired by Mr. Hancock?
I believe I did, yes.
All right. But it matters not because in the end they were done away with. Covid-S and Covid-O, Covid-S was chaired by the Prime Minister.
Yes.
But he also chaired Covid-O occasionally.
Yes.
But you were the main chair. And those meetings started in June, and Covid-S went all the way through to February 2021.
Yes.
Would it be right to say that Covid-O, the body you chaired, convened over or around 150 times between May 2020 and September 21?
I believe so, 145.
And we've heard evidence that Covid-19 Task Force was the secretariat for Covid-O.
Yes.
Helen McNamara raises this issue in her witness statement. She says, if there is to be a criticism of Covid-O and Covid-S, and Mr. Gove, the evidence quite plainly shows that Covid-S and Covid-O operated at a much better level than their predecessors. Her concern would be that they were quite narrow, that the full cabinet is better at bringing in a wider perspective, a body that is more grounded in consequences and in the complexities of the world as it is. Would you agree with that if there is a deficiency, if there was a deficiency, they were quite narrowly comprised bodies?
No.
Why not?
I think that for effective decision-making, when you're dealing with a crisis, the Cabinet is currently constituted, and this is no reflection on individuals, simply on size, is unwieldy. So when dealing with crises, there have always tended to be inner cabinets, war cabinets, or similar. Now, one can argue that perhaps the wrong people are around the table, but I think that the cabinet for as a structure, given the need for rapid action, as I say, doesn't meet the need of the hour. And we saw that in, for example, the Falklands War, where decision-making needed to be taken in a nimble way by the Prime Minister, her then Foreign Secretary, Defence Secretary and Chancellor.
Why do you say then in your witness statement that there was, in fact, a need to bring the wider cabinet into decision-making, and when it was done, it was occasionally too little, too late?
Well, there are several points there. The first thing is that you do need to have, first of all, a strategy team, an inner cabinet of whatever composition. Then you need cabinet committees in order to give effect to operational decisions, hence COVID-0. I think it is the case that when you've worked up what those decisions are, you do need a broader cabinet discussion in order to ensure that there is appropriate buy-in, that there is political consent, that there is collective agreement. But all of these things are matters of judgment, and they exist across a continuum. So what I would say is the reason why we moved away from the MIG model is, as we alluded to earlier, there's a danger in having a department mark its own homework. Again, no reflection of any individual. COVID-0 allowed oversight across government of how each individual department was seeking to deliver towards the agreed goal. Just Cabinet's role, yes, overall, I think one can look back at and say there were certain moments when Cabinet should have been involved earlier in some of that decision-making, but sometimes there was an understandable need for speed.
That's perfectly plain. There was nevertheless, though, there were occasions when Cabinet should have been more involved than it was. If you accept that. Was it the case, as we can see, that in relation to the 23rd of March decision to impose mandatory stay-at-home orders, that was, of course, announced to the country on the Monday. Cabinet didn't sit until the Tuesday, 24th. In relation to the second lockdown, the decision was effectively debated and resolved at a COVID ministerial meeting,
yes,
rather than by Cabinet. And in relation to the third lockdown, the driver for that decision came from a collective decision from the United Kingdom chief medical officers that the whole country had to go into level 5. Would you agree with those as statements of fact?
Yes.
Right. You, in a glorious message chain in September 2020...
So if you're moving on, Mr Keith, I've been asked to break at 1:45, but it's entirely whether...
My lady, that's a perfect moment.
Is it? I'm sorry we have to keep breaking, Mr Gove. I've also been asked to take a 50-minute lunch because we have so much to get through today. We're determined to make sure we get through your evidence today, Mr Gove. And so I shall return at 1:35.